What are the Chinese people really like? Do they adhere to all the stereotypes put on them by the West? Are they steadfastly loyal to the Communist Party? Are they either poor farmers or rich business people with very few in between? And are they all really good at math? Of course not, but my next guest, Evan Osnos, takes readers much deeper into just who today's Chinese really are, what their dreams are. It's his new book, Age of Ambition, Chasing Fortune, Truth and Faith in the New China. Osnos was the New Yorker's China correspondent for years. He's now based in Washington for the same magazine. Evan, you say that it's actually very easy to understand China in a sense if you can imagine the Gilded Age in America.
It's true. If you make a comparison to the United States experience, we're living right now through America in about 1890. Think about it. You know, we were coming out of the Civil War, which in China's case means the Cultural Revolution. It means pulling the country back together again. And one of the things you were also doing was building the country up. You know, we laid railroad tracks across the United States. China, as we know, has built more high-speed rail than the rest of the world combined. So there's this incredible sense of what's possible, but at the same time, that means that you're generating huge amounts of wealth, and it's going off into some people's hands and not into others.
So, and the real story of your book is the rise of Chinese individualism.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, what interested me most was the China that I'd always studied, for instance, in the United States, and when I went over there, everything that I'd read was about these broad strokes, about economic change and about the political forces, about 1/5 of humanity and what was happening to them. And when you got onto the ground, what you discovered was that people had the kind of private, intimate, perceptual changes in their lives that really mattered to them.
And a lot of times, the way they're trying to define themselves, be individuals, is to get rich. I mean, you talk a lot about that.
There's been this interesting progression. The first thing people wanted to do, of course, was to get rich. That's the most basic, natural human instinct in a case where people have been living in poverty. As they got wealthier, what they discovered was they needed to know who was setting the rules. They needed to understand about politics and policy, and that set off a kind of search for information. And that's why you've seen this incredible creation of investigative energy over the last 20 years. There's great journalists who are doing independent work, and then, of course, on the web. But then the third section...
Explain that, because people think of China as a closed society with a closed media, but you point out, actually, as long as you're not talking about kind of high politics, which is the legitimacy of the Communist Party, there's lots of journalism going on in China.
There's a huge amount of journalism going on. I wrote about a woman named Hu Shuli. She's the editor of a magazine called Cai Xin. And when she began, she figured out that there was this enormous story that wasn't being covered. It was about the economy, who was winning and who was losing. And if she could figure out how to write these stories just carefully enough, that she could get away with it. And there's a term in Chinese which is playing edge ball, which is hitting the ball, the ping pong ball, just the edge of the table so that you win the point without missing the table entirely. And what she figured out was that if those values could be transmitted to a whole generation of young Chinese journalists, that's transformative. And so you see it all over the place. People who have figured out that I can get away with this much without getting myself into trouble.
One thing I'm struck by the Chinese when I go there, and of course this is episodic and urban experiences by and large, is honestly how materialistic the culture has become, how individualistic it is, how materialistic, how obsessed with Western brands, for example. I mean, I often say if you go to the National Museum in Beijing, you'll only see foreigners, but if you go to the Louis Vuitton store, it's all Chinese. You wrote about Confucianism and the revival of Confucianism. How does this work? Is there now a kind of a feeling that maybe we've overdosed on materialism?
There is. There's been a really remarkable shift over the last few years. When you sat around at a dinner table with successful Chinese middle-class strivers 5 years ago, for instance, everybody wanted to talk about real estate. Or they would talk about travel, where they were going. Today, what they're talking about is who's your guru? Who is it that you're pursuing? What are you reading these days? There's a recognition that beyond the most basic material satisfaction, there are these bigger questions, these deeper questions. In the book, I call it the quest for faith. Look, in China today, there are as many Christians as there are members of the Communist Party. There's this enormous sense that the country is trying to define what its values are. What do we believe in as individuals and collectively as a society? And that's the next frontier, is how is the Chinese government going to accommodate this extraordinary search for ultimately what it means to be Chinese.
So what does all this leave you thinking about China, the Chinese? You know, in America, we have a tendency to get interested in countries or the world only if we get scared. You know, I mean, there's Ambrose Bierce's Devil's Dictionary says, war is God's way of teaching Americans geography. When you look at China, do you say to Americans, you know, this is a country that is more worrying, scarier, different, what?
What I'm most struck by is that there is a gap between what's going on at the elite political level, the conversation between the United States and China, which, after all, is getting tense. It's about the possibility for conflict, for instance, over territory. If you get onto the ground and you move into a Chinese neighborhood and you live there for a long time and you talk to people, you find out that the things that they talk about are very similar to the things we talk about in the United States. The gap in opportunity, the ability to educate your children and to be able to get your parents' health care, for instance. And what's amazing is how similar our lives in the United States and China are becoming at the very moment that our governments are finding it more difficult to talk to each other. So my goal, ultimately, and one of the reasons I've lived there for so long, is to try to help people understand what it actually feels like to be Chinese, because it's not as foreign as you might think.
And in order to do that, you have to read this book. Evan Osnos, thank you so much.